"I found your daughters." The grieving father ignored the homeless boy until he saw the proof. He almost didn't stop. The parking lot was a river of hurry, engines idling, carts clattering, people moving like they were trying to outrun something that waited for them at home. Daniel's polished shoes crunched on gravel as he navigated between SUVs and shopping bags, his briefcase a shield across his chest. He moved with that particular kind of purpose reserved for people who have rehearsed grief into efficiency, every step a decision to keep going. Underneath a slate sky, under the umbrella of a supermarket awning, a small pair of hands appeared. One held a half-eaten pastry, the kind sold warm and greasy from a street cart, flaky, savory, the smell of fried dough and onions sharp enough to cut through Daniel's carefully organized silence. The other hand trembled around a folded scrap of paper, stained at one corner with something like rain or a thumb smeared with jam. The boy was no older than 12. His hair was combed forward to hide his forehead, and his coat had been washed so many times it had acquired the texture of someone else's memory. He crouched between two cars, the heel of his sneaker tucked into oil-dark gravel, as if the world had taught him to make himself small and therefore invisible. Daniel saw him and kept walking. It was an automatic thing, the glance that didn't quite meet the eyes, the small tightening of the jaw that said, "This is not mine to fix." For years he had learned to carry the weight inside rather than let it leak into public places. Grief, he had decided, was private business. People around him respected that privacy. They gave him space. They gave him silent nods and fewer questions. "Sir," the boy called, a voice compact and urgent. It sounded thin against the wash of tires and distant radio. "Sir, please." Daniel slowed a fraction, the way someone hears a name in a crowded room and wonders if they're the one being spoken to. He was already late for a meeting that would decide 3/4 of next quarter's decisions. He had spreadsheets in his head like a grid of boxes that must be ticked off before lunch. He had taught himself the discipline of not being stopped by what he couldn't fix in one moment. But the boy didn't push. He only held out the pastry, and it was half of one, as if he'd already given away the other half to someone else. The offer was the kind of gesture that expected nothing in return. Simple, human, shame-free. The boy's eyes were steady. There was no pleading in them, only the kind of tired hope that belongs to people who have learned to bargain with the world in small coins. Daniel hesitated. The taste of fried pastry flicked a memory, a domestic memory soft and sharp at once. For a blink, he saw his daughters, 3 small faces around a kitchen table, crumbs on their shirts, a sun drawn on a scrap.
He had kept shards of those days like relics, in an old tin box sealed with grief and the kind of regret that had no neat lines to erase it. The memory came with a sound, a giggle, a song half remembered, a rhyme they used to invent. He pushed it down like a man clocking a dangerous weather report behind the glass. Instead of taking the pastry, he told himself to keep going. He had people who were counting on him that afternoon. Lives of neighbors he served in boardrooms depended on his punctuality. He had, somewhere inside those neat compartments, an idea of himself as competent, as someone who could hold the line when the world leaned on them. But the boy didn't withdraw his hand. He stepped forward, close enough that Daniel could smell the pastry's warm oil and something else underneath it, wet fabric and dust, the smell of the street after rain. The boy's scarred fingernail brushed Daniel's coat as he reached, and for a moment the man's world shifted axis like a building settling. There was a rustle at the boy's feet. Something small and dark rolled from beneath the car near where they stood. The boy's fingers darted down and retrieved a folded piece of paper, the kind of paper children use for drawing, thin, soft at the edges from being unfolded and refolded many times. He smoothed it with a palm that had scraped skin on the knuckles. "You drop this," the boy said, and he thrust the paper forward like an offering. His voice no longer asked for help, it stated a fact, and with that fact came an insistence. "Look." Daniel's hand hovered. The meeting, the briefcase, the ledger of his day were all balanced on that small suspension of time. He could have taken the paper with indifference, nodded away the interruption, tossed it in a pocket and never known what pattern marked that scrap until decades later when the world starts to fold around you in new ways. Instead, curiosity, that small animal no pressure could entirely kill, nudged him. He reached, slow and deliberate, as if obeying some muscle memory from a different man. The man who once used to kneel at all sorts of fragmented breakfasts and asked which color they wanted on their pancakes. On the sheet were 3 stick-figure girls, arms looped around one another, each crowned with a clumsy circle of hair. Above them, a sun with 6 teeth grinned crookedly,
fury and joy in one line. Beside the drawing, in a child's cramped handwriting, was a single name with a flourish on the last letter, a flourish that Daniel knew like the back of his hand. He had avoided the name for years, because names cut open wounds and refused to let them scab. It was a nickname his eldest had used in scribbled notes stuck to the fridge, Lulu, just a child's contraction of laughter shaped into letters, looped and happy, always ending in an oversized U as if the right vowels could hold the rest of the day together. His knees went soft.
He did not sink to the asphalt. He steadied himself against the bumper of the car as the world spun a quiet, slow round. The air seemed to be composed of soup cans clinking together. The noise of the parking lot became an ocean in which he was the lone swimmer who had been found clinging to driftwood. The boy saw the change. His face registered nothing like triumph. It was only a mirror. Someone who had offered something and had seen the thing offered make a crack in the armor of the adult before him. Daniel's vision blurred, as if someone had rubbed the edge of glass. For a flash, not even a full heartbeat, he was back in a kitchen with sunlight slicing across a linoleum floor. The girls were arguing over crayons. A radio played a song whose chorus he could still not sing without feeling a stitch inside his chest. He remembered practicing the tie on one daughter's neck and reading the same page of a book until the binding gave way. He had learned to manage the ache with plans and schedules, with business trips and late nights. He had convinced himself that structure could armor the parts of him that pulsed irregularly. But now, with a child's messy drawing in his hand, the plan dissolved like sugar in coffee. "You know her?" the boy asked, quieter now. Daniel clutched the paper as if it were a ticket to somewhere he had no right to enter. His mouth made shapes that did not form words at first. He had not expected recognition. Recognition implied a story could be told, undone, rewritten. He had told himself stories instead, that grief was a presence that he could hold separate from the world of obligations and people who smiled easily. "Yes," he said, the word a rusted hinge. He stopped because his throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with air. The parking lot had moved a little further away. His life had congealed around the scrap of paper in his hand. There was a woman nearby who watched from a folding chair where she had been tending the boy, her shawl wrapped tight like a fortress. She had a wrinkled face that spoke of years of keeping watch. When she saw Daniel's reaction, something in her softened as well, but not in a way that sought to invade his privacy. Instead, it recognized comprehension. Two people, once strangers, suddenly met in the space formed by shared memory. The woman rose. Her name was Rosa. At least, that's what she would say when introducing herself later. She had a patchwork blanket folded over her lap, a line of age-caused laughter at the corners of her mouth, and the way she watched made it clear she had seen this kind of remembering before, the kind that arrives like gravity and leaves people without the strength to hold their own bodies. Jonah, the boy, waited in the posture of someone who knew their smallness but wasn't ashamed of it. He had found the paper days ago in the pile of discarded things near a bus stop. He had kept it because in the drawing, the son's laugh looked like a small rebellion against ordinary sorrow. He traded half his pastry for the right to approach the man who smelled like essential oils and office air. Half the pastry he had given to an older man in a hoodie who had smiled like a person remembering the taste of childhood. "Why did you keep it?" Daniel asked finally. He had to ask. The simplest bridge between two strangers is sometimes a question. Jonah shrugged. "Because it makes me feel like someone somewhere is still drawing suns," he said. His voice had the soft cadence of someone imitating the big words he had overheard between adults, like shelter, benefits, vulnerable, without fully owning them. "And because your coat smelled like coffee, and my stomach smelled like nothing, so I thought maybe—" His sentence trailed. Daniel understood. The boys' lives intersected with his, in the way straight threads find one another in the dark. There was a moment then where every good intention Daniel had rehearsed for situations exactly like this got tested. His hand twitched toward the briefcase, toward the neat plan with compartments for decisions and people. His phone buzzed with a calendar alert he had scheduled for the meeting, Q3 projections, 2 p.m. He could leave the drawing in someone's care. The boys and women could keep their blankets and their pastries,
and he could continue to be the kind of man who manages pain through avoidance. Instead, he wiped a sudden dampness from his face with the heel of his hand and did something he hadn't expected. He asked the boy his name. "Jonah," the boy said. There was neither shame nor pride in how he said it. Names were small anchors in a life that often refused to stop moving. "Jonah," Daniel repeated it, tasting the syllables. "Have you had breakfast?" Jonah shrugged again. "Half of this." He was honest about hunger in a way that made the word blunt and sharp. Daniel realized how long it had been since he had heard someone say breakfast without any corporate metaphor attached to it. He felt guilty for the ease with which he could have bought the whole cart and not noticed the cost in the boy's life. It was a strange, modern shame, the awareness that a wallet could fix a hunger that his heart had only been pretending to numb. Then came a voice from his phone. The screen lit up with a message from a colleague. "You okay? Meeting starting in 10. Don't miss it." The world of spreadsheets and profit margins tugged like a leash. Daniel's thumb hovered over the quick reply button. The words he wanted to type, "Be right there," felt like a lie. Rosa, sensing the helpless calculus that was tempting Daniel, stepped forward and offered a thermos from a bag at her feet. It was full of something that smelled like hot broth and old spices, the kind of thing made by people who have long ago traded novelty for comfort. She poured a small cup and handed it to Jonah.
He took it with both hands and drank until there was steam in his throat and the color came back to his cheeks. "Why do you have a drawing like that?" Daniel asked. Because the drawing would not stop reverberating in him, its crooked sun like a signature he had been trying not to read for years. Jonah looked down for a moment, eyes traveling along the loop of the letters. "It was under a bench. There's a whole stack of papers there, like kids left them. I pick through them sometimes." He shrugged it in, then raised his chin. "The other day an old lady said she didn't want trash on her walk. I said, 'Trash?' She said papers get in the way of people stepping where they need to step. I told her it was not trash if it had a sun." Something in the way Jonah said sun was not jaunty, it was reverent. The small faith of a child attached to a scribble felt like a sacrament. Daniel folded the paper back along its creases and slipped it into his inner coat pocket like he was hiding contraband. He could have left it there and never thought another thing about it, but the weight of it at his chest felt like a stone that insisted he move differently. "Can I," he began, and then rephrased, because he had to be careful in how he reached into a life that wasn't his to push open. "Can I pay you for that pastry, or give you something for keeping the paper safe?" Jonah's gaze flicked to the briefcase, to the watch on Daniel's wrist, and then back to the man with a curiosity that smelled less like judgment and more like practice in understanding adults. "You don't have to," he said. "I wanted someone to see it." A lie of modern life is to suppose that gestures have to be monetary. Jonah's desire was simpler and harsher, to be seen, to have the scraps of his small world acknowledged by a person whose world operated on different frequencies. Daniel realized that every apology he had ever deferred to the altar of timing was now due, and instead of trying to sum up a life of regret in a sentence, he put a stack of bills in Jonah's hand and felt them in his own palm like a foreign object. Jonah didn't count them. He tucked the cash into a patch of jacket that might or might not be a pocket. He looked at Daniel as if to measure what this man had decided right then to become. "You should come with me," Rosa offered suddenly, as if she had been waiting to speak all along. Her voice folded into the space between them like an experienced bridge. "There's a place not far from here where they put blankets out. You can get warm, get dry. We have books too." Books. The word landed like a small bell in Daniel's chest. When his daughters were young, they used to bring home library books with covers bent at odd angles, the corners creased from loving. The girls had been the ones to teach him the joy of leaving one chair empty at the table on purpose, just to have the idea of company linger like a promise.
He had been terrible at keeping those promises, once grief had set a timetable. A heat that was not entirely shame bloomed in his face. He realized that the thing he had avoided was not the sight of the poor, but the sight of himself, unable to fix the wrong that had been done, to gather the pieces back together.
He had been practicing emotional abstinence, like a kind of liturgy. Now the rituals were flopping like empty sleeves. "I'm late," he said finally, and the sentence came out as an admission of how wrong both statements could be at once. Rosa nodded as if she had heard that line 100 times. "Sometimes being late is how you find the right place," she said. Daniel surprised himself by sitting, slowly, on a plastic crate Rosa offered. The world drew tight around them, the smell of frying, the tinny echo of a supermarket speaker announcing a sale, the distant shout of someone unloading a stroller. Jonah stayed standing, hands in his pockets, looking less like a child begging and more like a person on the edge of a choice. "You can come inside," Daniel said to Jonah before he thought the words through. They were clumsy, honest. "Just for a bit. I can get you something warm." Jonah blinked. It had the look of someone who had been offered an impossible favor and was deciding whether to accept without expecting strings. "Will you really?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel said, and the word was a small surrender. He had no fancy plan for how to bridge their worlds. He had only an exhausted conviction that his life up until that point had been a ledger of absences he could not account for. If there was any atonement possible, perhaps it started with a pastry shared on a damp morning. A car alarm barked and cut the scene in half. A woman with a stroller moved past them with headphones in, the world on her face. A man in a suit glanced at the trio, with a measure of tutting that was either sympathy or the sort of contempt purveyed by people who never needed handouts. As they stood to leave, the scrap of paper slipped, unnoticed, from Daniel's coat and fluttered to the gravel. Jonas stooped to pick it up without a word and pressed it back into Daniel's palm like an amulet. For a moment, their hands touched, the briefest contact that carried with it the weight of two lives acknowledging one another. At the door of the cafe, a place with steamed windows and a smell of roasted coffee that felt like a domestic treaty, Daniel fumbled with a wallet he suddenly felt distant from. He ordered a small tray of food, soup with a heavy broth, bread that was warm and shadow soft, and 2 cups of cocoa that came in paper cups but tasted like something requiring careful savoring. They sat at a corner table, near a plant under sickly fluorescent light. Jonah took small bites, not unlike a creature reacquainting itself with flavors. He pressed the drawing to his chest for a moment, as if to protect it from an inside world he had yet to explain.
"You kept it because," Daniel began, then realized the sentence mapped onto a territory of questions he had no right to occupy. "Why did you bring it to me?" Jonah's mouth made a slower shape. "Because you looked like you used to carry something with you," he said. "Like you were always thinking of someone who isn't there." His words were not prying, they were fact. "I thought maybe your someone would want it." The assertion landed like a small blow. Daniel had practiced an architecture of solitude, building walls and rooms where certain memories lived like museum exhibits he could visit under strict hours. Jonah's simple assessment cracked one of those windows and let in light that hurt and warmed at once. The conversation that followed moved slowly, and not all of it was spoken. Daniel told half-stories, the kind that keep shame and love in separate sentences. He said, "I had 3 daughters," and let the words float without disaster. He did not list names or dates or cause. Instead, he spoke of a ritual of laughter, of color, of books read aloud at midnight when the world was soft and the reading voice could be a world itself. He left the rest unsaid, wrapped in a kind of reserve born from years of not wanting to make others uncomfortable with his grief. Jonah listened like all children do, lightly, absorbing details and storing them in corners. He asked without malice about the drawings and whether the girls had liked sun pictures as much as the one on the scrap. Daniel's face changed when asked that, the muscles around his mouth folding like pages. He nodded and laughed once, a sound he had been surprised to still own. Between bites they spoke of small things, the way crayons melt in a car on a hot day, the kind of book with a missing page that someone still loves, why certain songs stick in a house and never leave. Conversation like this is neither therapy nor gossip, it's a map of human proximity. Daniel found himself giving directions to a bakery near his office, simply because the bread there tasted of a childhood he had not quite allowed himself to revisit. When he reached into his pocket for the paper again, the doodle of the crooked sun and the 3 stick girls felt heavier. He realized what a small thing memory is. A child's looped L could hold the axis of a whole day's orbit. He thought of the tin box where he'd kept scraps of his daughter's handwriting, of an old locket in his drawer whose clasp had once held a lock of hair. He had buried relics in his life and thought that would preserve them. But the paper in his palm had a living quality. It had crossed hands in weather and somehow reached out like a message in a bottle. He couldn't explain the path, and Jonah didn't need him to. The boy had found it and delivered it, and in delivering it, he had pulled a string that snapped taut across Daniel's chest. At the edge of their small table, a young woman with a camel coat and a lanyard clipped to her badge brushed past.
She dropped a paper on the floor. Daniel bent and picked it up for her automatically, because some habits of courtesy are contagious. She smiled with the impersonal warmth of commuting civility and mouthed thanks as she left. Outside, the day had paled to something like exhaustion. Daniel's phone buzzed again, and this time he let it ring. He wanted, for once, to see where an act of attention might lead. He felt the familiar pull towards scheduling his life into neat compartments, but the scrap of paper annoyed him with its refusal to be filed. Before they left, Jonah showed him another small thing, a book with pages missing, a faded picture of a cartoon animal stuck to the inside cover. In the margin, someone had written in small letters the phrase, "Always come back." Daniel read it twice, slowly. The handwriting was not his daughter's, but the sentiment struck the same chord as the drawn sun. He could have walked away with these small artifacts and kept them in his pocket as small weights. But as he left the cafe, he made a decision that surprised him. On the drive back to his office, Daniel held the folded paper on the passenger seat like a talisman. The city unrolled in grays and glass, in stoplights and plazas where people texted and walked like they were in two places at once. He had a meeting that would, in a civilized world, matter to shareholders and plans. He had to make choices. He parked, and his briefcase seemed to weigh more than before. He thought of calling someone, a sister perhaps, or the only friend who knew the rough map of his grief. But instead, he opened his contacts and stared at a name he had avoided. A number of a woman who had once been part of the household of the three little sons that now lived only in drawings and memory. He didn't call. He couldn't, not yet. Instead, he slid the drawing into the tin box whose lid he kept in the back of a drawer. The sensation of closing the lid felt different this time, an act not of shutting away, but of placing something in a place where it could be found. As he strode into the glass tower where decisions were made, the corridor lights flickered in rhythm with a heart he had not decided to mend. A junior associate, tall, efficient, practical, intercepted him with a question about the meeting. "You okay?" she asked, curious at his slower step. Daniel nodded, but couldn't articulate the fissure that had opened. Later, in the boardroom, with forecasts projected onto a pale screen, Daniel's attention wandered across numbers and scenarios to a child's crooked son in a drawer across town. He kept thinking about the boy who had given him a pastry and a drawing, the woman with the patchwork blanket who offered broth, and the way a scrap of paper had the brute force to unhinge months of self-imposed stoicism. He found the words to answer the associate, "Yes, I'm fine," and then wondered privately, which parts of us are fine, and which are merely contained.
The meeting ended with applause that sounded like machinery restarting. As people filed out, exchanging handshakes taut with corporate humidity, Daniel remained seated for an extra moment, the drawing a quiet weight against his palm, hidden beneath the conference table. His colleagues assumed he was preparing for the next obligation. He was preparing instead for a decision he had not yet named. Whether the proof in his pocket would be contained as memory, or whether it would compel him to change the course of his life in ways that are never part of the quarterly forecast. Outside, the light had shifted. The day was neither bright nor dark. It was a weather that sits between seasons and makes you want to prepare. Daniel thought of how many small gestures had passed him by because he had been too busy to notice them. He thought of Jonah's steady eyes and the old woman's shawl. He thought of the crooked sun and of the sound of a child's laugh that still lived, fossilized and fragile, under his ribs. He walked back to the parking lot. Cars gleamed like silver shells, impatient. There was a movement near the row where he had first stopped, a cluster of people, a bustle of voices. Jonah was there, sitting on a curb now, his elbows on his knees. Rosa had folded her blanket in a new way that suited the evening chill. Daniel approached and felt all the contradictions of his life fold into a single reed-thin line. He did not know how the rest of the day would proceed. He did not know whether offering help would solve anything permanent, but he could feel in his chest
a small, unnameable need to do something beyond the polite motions of condolences and calendar entries. He cleared his throat and said without ceremony, "Tomorrow, bring that drawing. Bring whatever else you have. Come by the office near the river. There are people there who can help with school enrollment. If not, we can go to the community center. I can." Jonah looked up surprised. The word school hung between them with a promise neither had formalized. There was a caution in the boy's gaze. Years of being told later taught him to discount immediate offers. "You sure?" Jonah asked. Daniel found his answer in the steady set of a jaw he had not realized he still possessed. "Yes, I mean it." The boy's smile broke like light through a cloud, not wide but honest, like someone who had discovered a small opening into a place they had only peered into from outside. As they parted that evening, Daniel to his apartment where the tin box sat like a pulse, Jonah to the patchwork shelter where Rosa kept a kettle on a tiny stove. A paper slipped from between the pages of Daniel's notebook and fluttered to the street. It wasn't the drawing this time, but a little sticky note with the grocery list and the word Lulu pinned in the margin. Jonah, watching, stooped and picked it up. He folded it carefully and kept it for himself, the way people keep small truths like talismans.
Daniel walked home with the city a soundtrack of distant horns and a siren pretending not to be urgent. He could have, at that moment, closed the tin box and walked away into the architecture of his life. Instead, he placed the drawing on top of the box and left the lid slightly ajar. The proof had been handed to him in a way that didn't demand a verdict. It only demanded attention. That was all it wanted at first, to be recognized. Recognizing it didn't solve anything immediate. It did, however, rearrange a small part of him. He sat at the edge of his bed, the light from the street lamp softening the room, and for the first time in years, read through the childish loops of names and lines until sleep came. His grief did not dissolve. It simmered with a new variable: action. He didn't yet know what that action would require: time, money, legalities, patience, the slow work that doesn't make headlines. What he knew was that a boy in a coat and a scrap of paper had made him stop being a man who only kept his mourning to himself. When the night deepened, Daniel opened the drawer and took the tin box out. Inside there were pressed flowers, a promise card with a cartoon moon, and a hairpin with a faded ribbon. He put Jonah's drawing on top and closed the lid the rest of the way, but not tightly. The box had space now, and its new creak sounded like a door left on a hinge. He set his phone on the table and scrolled through messages until one stood out, a terse text from a colleague reminding him of the next morning's obligations. The world would still expect him to be punctual. The world would still demand reports and meetings. But now there was a new ledger he had not expected to start balancing, one that involved people who could not be reduced to numbers. As he drifted toward sleep, his last thought was not of the meeting, but of a crooked sun with teeth that looked like a child's defiance against darkness. He didn't know the path that led from a scrap of paper beneath a car to the place where a father meets the lives of strangers, but he suspected, as all men suspect when they stand on the edge of a decision, that small gestures, shared food, a saved drawing, a cup of broth passed from a hand to another, are sometimes the slow machinery that remakes good people. Outside his window, Jonah rolled, somewhere under a thin blanket, his hand curled around the folded sticky note with "Lulu." It was a thing he would carry in the days to come, not because it claimed to be evidence in a courtroom, but because proof, when it is honest, sometimes simply asks to be seen. If this voice of a story has reached you so far, and you're moved by the way small things can alter a life, consider subscribing for more stories that ask you to look twice. There are many Jonahs and Daniels at the margins. Sometimes all it takes is to notice. The next morning arrived with brittle light and an intent that felt heavier than it should. Daniel dressed carefully, as if each garment could armor him against the awkwardness of stepping into other people's lives. He took the tin box with him, the drawing folded inside, and drove toward the city center with a sense that nothing in his life would be quite the same after this day. He found Jonah where he'd said he'd be, and Jonah came with a backpack that was mostly empty but contained a library of small resilience, a tattered paperback book, a shoelace tied at the zipper, a pebble that shone like a piece of a river. Behind the boy walked Rosa, who moved as if she were carrying the weather in her shoulders and the patience of someone who had seen people make new beginnings, unevenly and beautifully.
As they turned the corner toward the community center, a man in an immaculate suit, hair lacquered like a photograph, stood at the entrance with an expression that could be read as curiosity or calculation. He was Marcelo, the kind of figure Daniel had once been comfortable nodding across boardroom tables. He regarded Jonah with the sort of assessment people reserve for potential liabilities. "Are you certain about this?" Marcelo asked Daniel softly, his voice the practiced neutral of one who always calculated cost before compassion. "We have brand obligations, outreach protocols. This is not standard." Daniel felt the old instinct rise, protect the image, the calendar, the expectations. But the drawing in his pocket was a small combustion of the thing he had been hiding. He looked at Marcelo and then at Jonah, whose fingers tightened on the strap of his backpack. There was no grand speech. Instead, there was the simple act of choosing. "Yes," Daniel said, "we're doing this my way." Marcelo's brow tightened, but he did not press the issue. He has spent years building structures that he believed could maximize efficiency. He had never been wrong about numbers, but numbers never asked him whether a man could be something other than efficient. He would learn, if the path stretched far enough, that profit and kindness can have friction, and friction, if tended to with care, can generate warmth. Inside the community center, the air held the smell of old books and the sound of volunteer laughter stitched between folding chairs. A woman at a desk asked for Jonah's name and his birth date. "Do you have a guardian?" she asked with the bureaucratic care of someone attempting to channel resources where they belonged. Jonah and Rosa exchanged a look. Rosa answered for him, steady as a lighthouse. "I'm with him. He stays with me sometimes." Her words were not legalese, but human, and the woman behind the desk took notes with a trained empathy of someone who deals with messy lives and tidy forms all at once. They filled out forms, each X a quiet spelling of a life. Daniel tried to help with the writing. His handwriting had been neat in college.
He filled a line for emergency contact with his own name and number because in the absence of anything else, he was the one who had made a seemingly impossible phone call the previous day to tell the community center he would like to sponsor a place for Jonah at school if it could be arranged. The act of volunteering his name felt like a tiny defibrillator attached to a part of him that had been asleep too long. As paperwork moved at the pace of an old river, a volunteer brought out a box of books for the children. When Daniel opened it, the first book his hands found had a ribbon bookmark tied with an amateur knot. He opened to the marked page and found a scribble in the margin, a child's handwriting that said in neat letters, "Always come back." He stared at the sentence until the edges blurred. The phrase had already appeared twice in his day, like a refrain in a song he had not realized he'd been humming. He could have kept his hands away, kept his pity at a prudent distance, but he found himself picking books, a small pile, for Jonah and for other children who had come with reluctant hope. Some of the books were worn, some had the corners of pages thumbed soft by the hands of past readers who had loved them too well. Daniel bought them all, the volunteer protesting just enough to make it feel official. Outside, as they loaded the books into a tote bag, a man in a suit, different from Marcelo, this one older and softer-eyed, stopped Daniel. "I've heard you decided to get involved," he said. His face carried the class of someone who had been coached to be charitable in public. "We had a meeting planned for this afternoon. I hope this won't interfere with your responsibilities." Daniel looked at the man and thought of his daughters, of the way they used to make constellations of crumbs on the kitchen table. He remembered the tin box and the way a child's son had managed to unseal things that weeks of therapy had not. He thought of Jonah's steady gaze and Rosa's worn hands. "I think some responsibilities are more important than meetings," he said. The man's eyes widened, the briefest micro-expression of scandal. His lips parted in a way that almost made his expression fragile, a small, surprised aperture, as if air had been asked to be kinder than it felt. The man in the coat, polished and practiced in the currency of civility, recovered quickly and cleared his throat. "We must be careful," he said, voice low and precise. "Policies exist for a reason. There's liability. We can't." Daniel looked at him, and then at Jonah, at Rosa, at the small pile of books tucked into a tote bag that smelled faintly of paper and broth. Something in him loosened, an old, rusted mechanism that had kept him from touching the things he feared most. Shame, hope, a history of absence.
The choice before him was simple in its moral weight, even if complicated in logistics. Keep the meeting,
keep the image, keep on being the person his calendar expected, or follow the evidence of a child's drawing and see where it led. He chose the sun. Policies are paper, he said quietly. People are not. The phrase surprised him by how firm it sounded when it found his mouth. The suited man's lips flattened, but he did not press further. Words like that had the awkward ability to make other people examine their balance sheets of sympathy and profit. Over the next days, the story of a scrap of paper grew into plans that turned into small, consequential actions. It began with Daniel using his position to open doors that rarely opened without a keycard and a long memo. He didn't pretend to know the right bureaucratic route. He made phone calls to people in the right offices and in the right nonprofits, and he offered resources rather than promises. He arranged for Jonah to be enrolled in a morning program, for Rosa to receive a voucher for a temporary room on nights when the weather closed in, and for a few battered but beloved children's books to be replaced with new copies that smelled of glue and possibility. Marcelo was not wholly absent from this unfolding. He watched with a guarded frown, occasionally reminding Daniel of budgets and optics. "We can support, yes," he said on one afternoon in the glass-walled office where decisions were made, "but we have to be strategic. We cannot become a charity. The company has guidelines." Daniel listened, measured the tone in Marcelo's voice that had the same chord as someone who had once been praised for keeping spreadsheets honest. He also remembered a sun drawn in loops and a child's thumb-smeared hope pressed to his chest. "Strategy includes people," he replied. "If strategy ignores the people, then numbers become meaningless." It was not a dramatic conversion. Marcelo did not burst into a tearful admission or a monologue on compassion. He asked questions. He requested a pilot program outline. He insisted that procedures be drafted. Daniel complied. Together, awkwardly, bureaucratically, humanly, they built a framework, a small fund for emergency housing, a partnership with the community center for school placement, and a volunteer schedule so that employees could offer reading time and mentorship without pulling the whole company into chaos. The first concrete proof that something was shifting came on a damp Wednesday when the center's director, a woman named Carmen with lipstick like a quiet flag, tapped Daniel on the shoulder and said, "We might have a lead." The language was careful, precise, the way people speak around news that carries both hope and the need for discretion. She led them to a back room lined with files, not crime scene files, but enrollment cards and photographs taken at summer programs. Carmen spread a few things on a table like offerings: a laminated activity sheet, a class photograph from 3 years ago, a stray library card. The photograph was not tidy. It showed a cranky son in the corner, a bunch of children holding up finger-painted suns, hair tangled, sleeves sticky from glue. Daniel's chest clenched before he had time to think. There, in the third row, one of the children had made the same crooked sun, the teeth, the uneven rays, the joyful bite of a child's defiance. And beside it, someone had scribbled a nickname in a hand that looped the same way he remembered. Carmen did not say, "We have them." She said, "We found these in a folder labeled Outreach, Past Participants." The proof did not come as a cinematic reveal of captives reunited. It came as a quiet, bureaucratic pile of marks that, when laid out, stitched a line back toward a life Daniel had feared lost. There was a check-in sheet with his daughter's names he had not called aloud when anyone else might hear him, written by a teacher in a handwriting that matched nothing so much as the pattern of days he used to live in. There was a note: "Lulu always brings sun drawings." Below it was a small, faded photograph of 3 little girls on a playground, hair in messy braids, one of them clutching a stuffed animal that Daniel's memory twined itself around. He did not need confirmation for more than this. Recognition is its own form of evidence when the lines meet like migrating birds returning to a familiar shore. He sat down slowly, the world tilting like a picture finally hung straight on the wall. Jonah, who had come with him out of loyalty and curiosity, watched without the wild hope of television reunions. He had, after all, been the one to hand over the drawing. He had understood the transactional honesty of his gesture. Offer something small, insist on being seen. Carmen, with the gentle efficiencies of someone who has shepherded many broken stories into calmer territory, explained the next steps. There would be calls to the youth program that had helped
Please, children, there would be questions about guardianship and contact. There would be forms. There would be caution, because bureaucracy moves in the language of best interests and protocols, not in the flushed, messy urgency of reunion. She promised discretion, and she promised to help. Daniel listened like a man learning to hear the language of possibility for the first time in years. When the calls were made, the facts that emerged were neither simple nor sensational. The girls had, years ago, been enrolled in a different program that had since changed hands. Addresses had shifted. People had grown up. Children he remembered with milk on their lips were teachers somewhere else now, or teenagers making small economies of their days. The director did not say, because she did not know, where every life had gone.
But she did say there were traces, photographs, notes, a teacher who remembered a child named Lulu, and her obsession with sons. It was not a neat ending, and Daniel did not pretend it was. What it offered him was the first clear vector back toward connection. He set his hand on the photograph as if grounding himself. The corners of the paper felt like an old wound that had grown calluses. He let a small, unexpected sound escape his throat. Not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob. An animal noise of relief and fear woven together. That same week, Jonah's attendance at the morning program became routine. He learned the names of teachers and slept in a warm room with a blanket that smelled of detergent and soap, a luxury that, when you have lived without many of them, holds a kind of sacrament. Rosa began seeing a social worker who helped her apply for a small pension and connect with a housing service that offered short-term rooms. Daniel found himself attending meetings not to steer mergers or acquisitions, but to sign forms that broadened the safety net for people who had always lived at the edge of it. The office changed in small human ways that numbers cannot chart. An internal memo invited employees to volunteer as reading buddies. Someone hung Jonah's crooked sun on a message board in the lobby with a sticky note that read, "Art by Jonah, future resident." It was a small joke, but the symbol of the sun began to spread, on mugs, on a corkboard, in the margins of quarterly reports, where someone doodled a tiny sun beside their signature. Marcelo, initially wary, found himself at a weekend volunteer session where he sat in a folding chair and read aloud from a book about oceans, his suit jacket draped over the back of a chair like something he had shed for an hour. And when a child asked him whether the whale in the story ever felt lonely, he answered, yes, and meant it. The most delicate scene came months after the scrap of paper had been found. It was a chilly evening when Daniel received a phone call from Carmen. "We found contact," she said. Her voice had the careful pause one uses when offering good news dipped in varnish. "They're in a program across town. They are minors. They have a worker assigned. They asked to meet." Daniel's heart made a sudden sound in his ears. All the little disciplined parts of him wanted to measure, plan, map. But both grief and hope had taught him an important lesson, that presence is more salvific than strategy when timing demands a hug. He told Carmen he would come, and the words soon left his mouth with a reverence it had not worn for years. The youth program was a low-slung building whose windows glowed with a warmth like someone keeping late hours knitting. There were posters of rules and lists and photographs with suns in the corners. Daniel waited in a narrow room beside a row of chairs, his palms dry on his knees. He had rehearsed sentences in the car, and then not used them. How do you speak to a life you had once been part of, from a distance measured in whole years? You do not have perfect words. You have small truths and patient repetitions. When the door opened, 3 teenagers entered. They were not the small stick figures from the drawing. They were larger, carrying the aggregate textures of their years, one with a nervous twist of hair, one with paint under a thumbnail, the oldest with a day pack and a practiced politeness that resembled armor. Their eyes scanned the room, cautious as birds. For a beat, Daniel recognized a smile that had once bent like light through water, the tilt of a mouth that used to grin at spilled milk and story time. He rose and tried to let his face be simple and unadorned. "I'm Daniel," he said, and it was stranger than any title he had ever carried in a meeting. I used to." He stopped, because speech can be an invasiveness. He let silence give them space to decide how to receive him. The eldest spoke first. Her voice was a mixture of caution and curiosity. "We had papers," she said, looking not at Daniel but at Carmen.
And then a lot of things changed. We remember a man who used to bake something at home. We remember songs. Daniel felt his throat tighten at the ordinary inventory of memory. He sat and listened. There was no dramatic collapse into tears, no theatrical forgiveness. There was the slow, fragile work of people reacquainting themselves across a seam of lost time. He asked small questions about favorite colors, about songs, and the conversation built little bridges, a mention of a bakery on a street that smelled like cinnamon, a laugh at a joke about crayons, a discussion about careers and silly ambitions. When one of them reached into a backpack and produced a makeshift drawing, a son with fewer teeth but unmistakably in the same family of marks, the room contracted with a human gravity. They did not leap into an embrace. They were not characters in a tidy narrative. They were teenagers holding the careful architecture of what they had become. Daniel did what he could do. He offered a meal. He offered money with the awkwardness of someone who had not yet learned how to give without making the other feel indebted. And, perhaps most daringly, he offered to be present without strings attached. Before leaving, he took out the tin box he had carried like a talisman and placed Jonah's original drawing alongside the photograph Carmen had found. The teenagers leaned in and traced the lines of the sun as if reading a map. The one who had the nickname Lulu, a name that had once been a private jewel, touched the looped U on the margin of the photograph, the way someone might press a bruise to see if it still hurt. There was recognition and a small, complicated relief. "He kept this?" one of them asked, surprised in a way that made the room feel like a small cathedral. "He did. I did." It was not a resolution.
It was the start of something that would require patience and the careful undoing of old absences. They arranged for gradual contact, respectful meetings supervised by workers, and a plan that prioritized the teenagers' ability to decide what relationship they wanted. Daniel learned how to be present in measured ways, showing up for a recital, answering messages without expectation, being an adult who would not demand forgiveness as a currency. Outside these private steps, the broader changes continued to take root. Jonah began to thrive in school. A teacher who loved messy art invited him to an after-school program where he learned how to bind his own little sketchbooks. Rosa moved into a small room with a proper bed of her own for the first time in years. The community center's shelves, once dusty, filled with children's books funded by contributions from employees. The company's volunteer program expanded, not as a PR exercise, but because people found it good. It changed the culture in small ways, a policy that allowed for a few paid volunteer hours, a matching fund for housing grants, colleagues who began to understand that engagement with humanity was not some charitable sidebar, but part of being civilized. There were moments of friction. Not everyone in the office agreed with Daniel's choices. Some worried about slippery slopes. Who would decide when corporate budgets should include social support? There were overheard questions about boundaries and whether personal feelings should direct professional decisions. Daniel absorbed these criticisms like small, prickly stones and learned to address them with the calm patience he had once had for spreadsheets, by proposing clear metrics, transparent processes, and safeguards against paternalism. He insisted always on dignity, on the right to give help without spectacle, and to let recipients have agency. In time, the tin box returned to being a talisman rather than a sealed vault. Daniel kept the drawing where he could see it, pinned to a corkboard in his study, near a photograph of a tree that used to climb. On certain evenings he would take it down and smooth the folds with a finger and think about how small things accumulate meaning. Jonah would sometimes come by the office with a sketch. He had become an unofficial mascot of sorts, his son reappearing in memos and murals. The quiet miracle of the story, if one wanted to call it that, was not a final cinematic joining of all hearts into flawless reconciliation. It was a collection of small choices that created new habits: meals shared, school books bought, a summer job that taught Jonah the correct way to sweep a floor, and the dignity in earning a few dollars. It was the way Marcelo, months later, handed a cup of coffee to a volunteer and asked about a reading schedule as though he had always meant to do this.
It was Rosa learning to trust a social worker enough to accept a small apartment, which she painted an outrageous teal color on a sunny afternoon. There were quiet rewards for Daniel. He learned to receive exasperation without turning away. He learned how to apologize without cataloging a grief as an excuse. He learned that presence, the steady, sometimes boring presence of showing up, can be a form of repair. Most of all, he learned how to let memory be crumbly and human rather than a shrine to be avoided. On an ordinary afternoon some months later, the community center held a small fair. There were paper flags and a table with pastries, a nod, covert and sweet, to the pastry that had started it all. Daniel arrived early and found Jonah already there, standing near a table where kids were painting suns on fabric squares. The boy looked up and grinned, then handed Daniel a half piece of a new pastry he'd claimed from the vendor. They ate side by side on a bench, with the air smelling of sugar and paint. Across the way, one of the teenagers, the one with the paint-smudged thumbnail, waved at Daniel. She came over and sat at the end of the bench, fiddling with a ribbon. They spoke of small things, the difficulty of an essay due tomorrow, a book they loved, a song that made them both feel brave for reasons they could not fully explain. Daniel listened. He offered a quiet pride that did not demand reciprocation. Later, when the sun was lower, the teenagers pinned their suns to a communal banner. Jonah added his, bright and jagged. Daniel pressed his palm against the fabric and felt something like warmth return that he had thought irretrievable. He did not claim to have saved anyone. He had simply, finally, allowed himself to be used by a handful of small gestures that had become practices. The last image the story leaves is not a tidy tableau, but a simple human scene. Daniel at his desk one evening, under the soft lamplight, pinning Jonah's original drawing to a notice board in the lobby of his company. The drawing sits among memos and reminders, a stubborn sun peeking out among duty. Employees glance at it and smile. A child's mark, once invisible in a pile of discarded things, now keeps company with calendars and meeting requests. When someone asks him, months later, what changed, Daniel will not offer a single flawless sentence. He will say perhaps that he started noticing, that he let himself be interrupted, that he learned to trade a ledger of excuses for a ledger of small, consistent acts. He will say, if he is honest, that the proof he had been given, a folded scrap with a crooked sun and a looped U, did not by itself make anything whole. It simply made him stop and look. The rest was work. And the people around him changed too. Jonah draws suns on lunch napkins at work. Rosa hangs a small photograph of a kettle on her bulletin board, where she pins her visa appointment reminders and grocery lists.
Marcelo, when someone reminds him of the day they first disagreed, shrugs and says, "I was wrong about how much we can do." He means it, but he also knows how complicated change is. They all know now that compassion requires systems to be fair and hearts to be brave. If you have reached the end of this story and feel a small tug in your chest, consider this. There are many Jonahs and many Daniels near you, not always in a parking lot, but sometimes sitting beside you on a bus or standing in line, their hands folded around a baked good, a scrap of paper, or a folded hope. Notice them. Small acts, sharing food, offering time, giving space, are not cures, but they are the instruments that build a life toward repair. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that looking twice matters. Consider supporting a local shelter or after-school program in your area, not with the expectation of dramatic headlines, but with the patience for small, consistent help. The world tilts when we are willing to be interrupted, and sometimes the smallest proof is all it takes to turn a life toward light.